I've covered everything. We will be sending out a feedback form. Pam's just put a note in the chat there about consent. Thank you. We will be sending out a feedback form. Your feedback's really important to both Matthew and Simon as they deliver these workshops. There will be a 45-minute presentation, and then we'll be doing a Q&A at the end. If you want to pop your question in the chat, we can circle back to it. So if you think of a great question and worried you're going to forget it, please pop it in. Otherwise, yeah, we'll have a time for questions at the end. So without further ado, I will hand you all over to Matthew and Simon.
Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Tuesday. So a Procurement Act lunchtime sandwich for all. Hope this is interesting and useful for you all. Just to introduce myself, I'm a director at Monarch. My focus is really around income generation strategy planning. Matthew introduced himself in a minute. He's more around the bid management side of things, but I come to this with about 30 years of experience in business development, marketing and sales, also coach and facilitator. Matthew, do you want to say a couple of words as well?
Yep, I'm Matthew Wright, Head of Bid Operations at Monarch. I have 20 years working in the voluntary and community sector as a bid manager, and a good 11 years working as a commissioner in a local authority in the northwest of England.
Great, thanks Matthew. So yeah, before we dive into it, I'll just very quickly explain who Monarch are. So basically our bread and butter is being experts in generating income for VCSEs through public sector procurement. It really is our expert area. We're all about providing capacity and pure expertise in this area, which a lot of VCSEs might not necessarily have. We do this through grants and tenders, corporate fundraising, PR, and it really is an end-to-end service that we provide. So you can see the service list there. Key, I think, in this is around pipeline development, bid management, writing, and I know we'll touch on a bit around social value assessment as well, which I think will be relevant for this presentation. But we do other things as well. I think Matthew will back me up on this. The more complicated, the better. So yeah, that's kind of our key area. Our credibility. You know, why are we speaking to you today? You know, we've helped raise income with our clients of nearly 30 million in the last 15 months. Over 80% win rate for public sector contracts. We're very strong in the southwest. We really know what we're doing there, and actually our win rate is around 91%. Matthew and the team are APMP accredited. I don't know if anyone knows that, what that is, but essentially it's the gold standard for bid writing, and we use APMP methodology through the work that we do. West is best. I live in North Somerset. I've lived here for a long time. I love it. But it's also, like I say, Monarch's core area, I would say. And in the last 14, 15 months, we've delivered 12 tenders in this area with a contract value of about 13 million. So yeah, we kind of know our stuff. Really good ROI. You know, I won't go into this too much. We're referenceable. For those who know Lynn at Community First Wiltshire, you know, I'm sure she'll be pleased to sort of let you know what it's like to work with us. And Procurement Act ready. Okay, now we're talking about what we're here for today. And you know, I think any organisation or anyone who's saying they're an expert in the Procurement Act is really stretching the truth. But we've made a real concerted effort to understand it, and we've run, you know, multiple Procurement Act webinars now for various VCSE networks across the UK. We feel like we understand it at a deep level. We're understanding more and more all the time. You know, Matthew will go into this as well, but you know, some of our guys are actually accredited as commissioners in the Procurement Act as well. So we do feel like we know what we're talking about. Quickly, the running order of today. We'll go through the key reforms and what it really means for you in the VCSE sector, some practical steps that you can take away, some actions that you should really consider doing. That will take about 45 minutes, to be honest, and then hopefully 45 minutes, and then a Q&A at the end. As mentioned earlier, we'll be sending out a feedback form through your regional reps. Really would appreciate just a moment to fill it in. It really does help us sort of plan these for the future and just get better and better, essentially. We also want to send out the slides, so if you've got a moment, do just pop your email into the chat now, and we can send the slides to you as well, so you can show your team or refer back to them as we go. So we're not expecting you to write a billion notes in this. All right, next slide. Okay, why does this matter? What is the VCSE context? So the Procurement Act in 2023 replaces the Public Contracts Regulation in 2015. The goal of it really was to streamline procurement processes, which were cumbersome and complicated. It's to increase transparency, improve supplier access to government contracts. It's really all about accessibility at the end of the day, and it's really important, really, for you to understand this. I can't really underline that enough. The public procurement accounts for billions of funding and opportunities, and it really would be a shame for the Southwest to be missing out on this kind of money. So yeah, over to Matthew, who is going to now ask you a question, and he will be able to fill in a lot more details around the Procurement Act.
Thank you very much, Simon. So if you could just use the React panel, that will be the top right-hand corner of your window, I think, if you're accessing on the web, just to give me a wave or a thumbs up. How many of you have been invited to briefings by your local authority or your local commissioners on the Transforming Procurement Programme? Because that will give me a good idea of how to pitch the next few slides. I'm going to assume that's nobody. I don't think anybody's been invited to these Transforming Procurement sessions. Transforming Procurement is the programme by which the Procurement Act is being introduced, and is the major civil service training programme that's being engaged in right now to make sure that commissioners and procurement teams are up to speed with the 129-page piece of legislation and the dozens of pieces of guidance that enable them to put the Procurement Act into force. So if no one's been invited to those sessions, I'm a bit better idea how to pitch the next few slides. So next slide, please, Simon. Just one back. No. There we go. That's the one. So today we're going to have a brief look at two pieces of legislation. The first is the Procurement Act, and the second is the Provider Selection Regime. Now, the Procurement Act applies more broadly, but in the case of England, it applies to all public bodies, and there's a series of thresholds around which the Act applies, depending on how much contracts are worth, who's commissioning it, which sector they're working with, what regime they're using. So there's a bit of a sliding scale of applicability across England. And the provider selection regime applies only to NHS commissioners and only to a focused subset of service provision. Essentially, with both pieces of legislation, they look at the same aspect, the same problem from really different perspectives. Whilst the provider selection regime removes NHS bodies from the Procurement Act and thus unpicks quite a lot what was in the public contracts regulations, the Procurement Act will then look at competition as a default setting. So if they're looking to buy something, if they're looking to purchase something from the market, the default setting for them will be to engage in some form of competition. And direct awards are possible, but they're the limited exception. They're mainly around emergencies, technical reasons, and really niche purchases like works of art. The main focus of the Procurement Act is around transparency And as a consequence of that, if you're working with commissioners outside a procurement timetable, that the engagement that you have with them should be focused on positioning your organisation within that market only. You're not going to have much influence in terms of what procurement procedure is being used. The provider selection regime looks at that issue from a slightly different angle. NHS bodies prefer direct awards, and they're focused on retaining incumbencies. So competition under the provider selection regime is really the exception. And as a consequence, when we're working with organisations to have influence, what we would attempt to do, if you're not an incumbent, you're not holding those contracts and you wanted to get into those markets, then it's possible to go through some engagement processes to enable those NHS bodies to decide what process they're going to use. And we would recommend that you don't focus merely on how you position yourself in that market, but also on the procedure that they're going to select on the provider selection regime. So essentially, 30 years of procurement legislation wiped away, clean slate. Procurement Act applies to all public bodies and focuses on competition. Provider selection regime, NHS bodies, mainly healthcare services, and looks to direct award first rather than going to competition. Overall, both processes look at simplifying the procurement process, and for the Procurement Act, that has reduced the number of potential procedures down to 2. There's a real requirement to remove barriers to the voluntary community sector, and there's a real focus on engagement and transparency. Overall, under Procurement Act, there are now 14 new notices. And what's important about those notices is under the old regime, you would only have notices covering the contract period. So a notice will come out telling you a tender was about to be launched. They would have a whole series of notices throughout that. And then once the decision was made, award notice and nothing else. Now we're in a position whereby procurement teams are required to declare what their plans are for the next 18 months. They're required to have periods of engagement. They're required to issue notices throughout that tender window, but there are also notices that come after the tender that talk about how the provider is performing, what is happening with that contract, when they're likely to reprocure. So there's a lot more transparency involved in these processes and a lot more opportunities to gain intelligence. And within that transparency regime, it's mandatory to give feedback to all bidders. So there's a lot more intelligence we can be gathering as a result of the Procurement Act. Next slide, please, Simon. So in terms of the Procurement Act, what we can focus on for the voluntary community and social enterprise sector? Well, there's a real change in culture from procurement teams. The mindset that procurement teams are being asked to adopt is commercial engagement, and engagement with those suppliers and being transparent, and value for money. So as part of these sweeping changes, the main focus being around Brexit, the Procurement Act was designed to take us away from the procurement directive in the EU and formulate a new basis for how procurement law is going to work. The Procurement Act sits as that umbrella, and underneath that you have the procurement regulations which define how procurement should take place. So as part of that regulation, they bring forward sweeping changes that make it significantly easier for voluntary community, social enterprise and small and medium enterprises to access, compete for and deliver public sector contracts. Now, how that's been enacted is by introducing lower barriers to entry. The Act imposes duties on public bodies to remove obstacles for smaller organisations, to make bidding more accessible and to make it more proportionate. For example, they've removed the requirement to provide evidence of insurance levels up front. They have amended requirements around producing audited accounts, so they can be relaxed or replaced with fairer alternatives. So if you're new to a market or you're a newer organisation, there's more opportunity for you to bid, whereas previously you might have been prevented by due diligence requirements. There's been a huge push to simplify processes. So the whole concept behind the new system was to reduce bureaucracy and to streamline the bidding process. So it should become much more easy for voluntary and community sector organisations to identify, bid for and negotiate contracts, particularly as now there's a central digital platform for publishing notices, and we will get onto that later. There's a real emphasis on social and community value across all contracts, so even large infrastructure, large primes, big corporate organisations have to evidence that they are making, they're producing additional value under the Social Value Act, and procurement teams are required, I think the wording is, to have regard to the importance of maximising public benefits, whereas the previous regime said that they just had to consider it. So there's a significant focus on embedding the requirement for social, economic and environmental outcomes into procurement decisions, which is a real step up from the previous legislative framework that only called for it to be considered. And in terms of evaluating bids, the whole concept of MEET has been replaced. So most economically advantageous tender has been replaced, and all award criteria must be on most advantageous tender, removing the economic consideration. So that means that value is considered more broadly. It will look more at the impacts you can make as a provider. It will look at things like job creation, community benefits, how you behave as an employer, particularly with marginalised communities, adults with disabilities, offenders, and sustainability. It was included in that measure of value. So contracts are no longer decided on price. And in our experience, that price element is becoming much less regarded. There are a couple of tenders we've been involved in recently where price has been fixed and hasn't even been included in the evaluation criteria. In terms of practical benefits to the voluntary community sector, much better payment terms. It is now required that payments must be made within 30 days, and there are penalties for public sector bodies that don't pay within 30 days. That does have its flip side. You may be working with local authorities that want improved payment terms for earlier payments, reducing your overall contract price slightly. But the whole concept behind this is to help you manage cash flow more effectively and make the voluntary sector less risky to work with. There's a lot more focus on transparency and oversight. So authorities have to be really open about their processes, provide feedback on tenders, and engage in annual reporting on delivery and public benefit. And contracts over 5 million require annual reporting on key performance indicators. So that will go onto the central digital platform for people to look at. And there also is a requirement for director opportunities. So public sector bodies are instructed to prioritise small, medium enterprises and the voluntary and community sector in the procurement strategies to increase spend with those groups as part of a national economic growth priority under the National Procurement Policy Statement. And one thing that we really would focus on is that early market engagement. The Act encourages proactive engagement with suppliers really early in the process. It gives you better visibility of what opportunities are available and gives you more opportunities to shape those contract requirements. Before I move on to the next slide, what we would say is that it's important to look at the Procurement Act not just as a bidder, but there's a potential to enter into the supply chains of other organisations. The focus on improving accessibility for small, medium enterprises is across the board, and for larger contracts, those prime contractors that may be going for multi-million and multi-billion pound contracts are encouraged to include voluntary and community sector organisations within their supply chain. So there's not just the opportunity to bid for these contracts, there's an opportunity to be part of a supply chain of much larger organisations as they move to meet their responsibilities under the Act. Next slide, please, Simon. So what three takeaways can we have from the Act? I think in terms of the new procedures, 5 procedures have been wiped away, and a couple of other sort of ancillary procedures have been removed, and those procedures come down to 2, and that's open procedure and competitive flexible. Now, the open procedure is what most people will understand as a tender. Anybody who is eligible can bid. There's no need for negotiation. Really good for straightforward contracts, usually single stage process. You put together a tender, put together your due diligence information, and you submit it. They assess it, come back with a response. Now, competitive flexible procedure replaces all the other procedures that were under the old regime. So essentially that means that the organisations that are seeking to make purchases design their own process. It can include negotiation, it can include dialogue, it can involve phased evaluations, multiple stages, and it gives you the opportunity to influence outcomes better because you're not just trying to respond to a specification in a really short time frame. So overall, open procedure, public procurement method, any interested supplier that's met the due diligence requirements could submit a tender for a contract. No restrictions on who can bid for those contracts other than the organisations that meet the due diligence requirements of the specification. So there's no kind of limiting of a field beforehand. All tenders go into one process, one single stage process. All the required information and documents have to be provided up front, and all bids are assessed at the same time. So that means that if you're preparing for that type of tender, you have to be well prepared in advance. On average, you'll have 3 to 4 weeks to submit that tender, and anything that you'll need to gather in terms of putting that tender together will need to be gathered, put together, processed and analysed before that window starts. So agility and flexibility and preparedness is really important if you're going to be bidding under an open procedure. Now, competitive flexible procedure is new. It's only introduced in March, so nobody has much experience in bidding under the competitive flexible procedure. It replaces a number of procedures that were really well documented, so you could predict how they would go. It was really obvious how the old procedures went, complex as they were. Now, you're in the position where contracting authorities can tailor a procurement process to suit the needs of each contract. So unlike that open procedure, where you just submit a tender, single stage, you wait, that means that there's potential for multiple stages. They're likely to be more complex. They're likely to require innovation. The authorities who are bidding under competitive flexible can choose from a whole range of different techniques. And that may mean that you enter into quite a prolonged process that has multiple stages, elements of negotiation, the need to redraft your tender submission multiple times, and the need to engage in interviews, presentations, and sometimes even site visits. So what that shift means is that you'll need to be prepared to respond rapidly and flexibly to those opportunities. Both processes will have strict timelines, and both elements will require a significant amount of preparation before you go into entering into those type of contracts. Next slide, please, Simon. Provider selection regime. Now, this is a real evolution in the way that the NHS has approached public healthcare procurement. This piece of legislation removes NHS bodies from the Procurement Act for certain healthcare services, and the intention is to enable NHS bodies to engage in collaboration, innovation, and quality-led delivery. And this offers new avenues for NHS bodies, particularly around primary healthcare, to secure and sustain contracts. Now, it applies to procurement of healthcare services, not products, but services, by NHS England, as was, integrated care boards, NHS trusts and foundation trusts. It doesn't cover goods, and it doesn't cover non-healthcare services unless they're part of a mixed procurement. So if you're providing any services that aren't related to healthcare for an NHS body, they're likely to be procured or re-procured under the Procurement Act. Anything that can be described as a healthcare service is likely to be procured under the provider selection regime. So things like hospital discharge services, home from hospital, health watch, and social prescribing. We've seen all that type of contract put under the provider selection regime. So the focus of this regime is to provide the best outcome for patients. Value for money is really important, and supported integration of care. So if you are looking to bid under provider selection regime, what they're looking for is collaboration, partnership, and real significant work across a healthcare service. Success under this regime won't depend on price. Whilst price is a consideration, what they're looking for is your ability to demonstrate impact, your ability to meet local needs, your ability to partner effectively with other organisations and the commissioning organisation. There are 5 procurement processes. The first 3 are direct award processes, and they're mainly there to serve incumbencies. So they're all about where the service hasn't changed significantly in terms of its spec, and the existing provider is doing well. They will all enable those services to be direct awarded. The other 2 procedures, if you're not an incumbent, are most suitable provider process and competitive process. And generally, you would need to influence around these being used. So most suitable provider process is non-competitive, and it's used where there's a potential to be more than one provider for that service, and the providers will be assessed against set criteria, mainly around performance. And the competitive process is used where the commissioner might not be clear about what they want, and that essentially goes to full market. And it's generally used where there's a service where the spec has changed or is new. So if you're looking to enter into NHS commissioning, they're the two procedures to look for: most suitable provider process and competitive process. Now, most suitable provider process is only really used where they've got evidence that the commissioner has sufficiently detailed knowledge of what's in the market and what's available, and they have to evidence that they could using that process from an informed position. So for voluntary community sector organisations, that would indicate there's going to be a greater emphasis on pre-market engagement, because the commissioner is going to have to develop that knowledge of the provider landscape. So if you are interested in engaging in this type of work with NHS bodies, it's really important to engage early, to engage often, and to engage positively with your local NHS bodies to enable you to then influence the selection of most suitable provider or competitive processes. Next slide, please, Simon. So what can you do? If you're already an incumbent, what we would advise is maintain performance. Service excellence is one of the methodologies by which direct awards are made. So make sure that you're achieving your outcomes, make sure you're getting good patient feedback, make sure that your compliance data is consistently positive. Ensuring that you're delivering a quality service will be absolutely vital in both the direct award processes and most suitable provider selections. If you're not an incumbent, what's really important is to engage, to invest now in those strategic relationships, to identify the commissioners, the NHS bodies that you want to work with, and make sure they're aware of who you are, what you do, how well you do it, and how vital that service is for your local community. Be really absolutely prepared to evidence your value, particularly your social value, to the community and to the NHS body. Make sure you develop portfolios, demonstrate your impact, demonstrate how you can be innovative, demonstrate how you align with local health priorities. Absolutely vital if you're going to break into this market. Overall, monitor the opportunities that are coming out. There are tools out there to enable you to monitor what opportunities are available. The central digital platform is one, and make sure that you navigate those nuances. The provider selection regime is complicated. It's difficult to navigate, and if you can gain access to organisations that can assist you to navigate those complexities, then your chances of success are much better. Next slide, please, Simon. Social value is becoming much more important, particularly in the Procurement Act. There is a requirement to ensure that 10% of the score of all tenders is aligned to social value requirements. We're seeing really patchy implementation of that across England. Some local authorities, some local commissioners are paying lip service to the social value requirements. Others are being really stringent. We're finding, particularly in the southeast, there's a focus on not only evidencing that 10% of the score is aligned to social value, but 10% of the spend is aligned to social value. So there's an onus in those areas on organisations to evidence that they will be spending a significant proportion of the budget on achieving social value. In terms of social value, what does it mean? Well, different things to different commissioners. It generally means a framework by which social value actions are quantified into a financial value. And we're seeing the adoption of a number of different platforms across local commissioning. The most popular at present is the Social Value Portal's National TOMS, targets, outcomes and measures. And that looks at things like how you behave as an employer, particularly if you're providing opportunities for underrepresented groups. Are you employing people who are local? Are you upskilling people? Are you offering apprenticeships? Are you offering accredited learning? It looks at things like sustainability, so it looks at your environmental benefits, things like carbon reduction, ethical sourcing, using local supply chains, and engaging in a circular economy. And there's a lot in there about inclusion, with a real emphasis on supporting disadvantaged communities, workforce diversity, equal access to services. So if you can demonstrate that you're offering local employment, you're engaging with local suppliers to provide your services, you are maintaining your workforce diversity, you've got eco-friendly policies and practices in place, and you're engaging with your community, then you can score really highly in social value type questions. We're also seeing the implementation, particularly for larger contracts, of the Cabinet Office's model assessment criteria, the MACs, and we would invite you to go and read what is Procurement Policy Note 2 of this year, so PPN 002, and that describes all the social value model assessment criteria, what they mean and what you'll be measured against if you bid for that type of contract. The third model we're seeing, less popular, but it is cropping up in a number of contracts, is the HACT, the HACT, social landlord model, which looks at very similar headings to the national TOMS. So essentially, when we're looking at social value, it's less about how you impact on a community as a VCSE organisation, and more about how you impact on that community as an employer, as an organisation, as an organisation that provides development opportunities for people. Next slide, please, Simon. So as the Act has come into force at the end of February, and has been rolled out at a time when a lot of local commissioners are under pressure, what are we seeing as a consultancy? What we're seeing is both voluntary sector organisations and local commissioners being stretched. They're being expected to do more with less. Tenders are becoming more demanding. The requirements are becoming more demanding, and what you're expected to evidence in terms of additional value is increasing. We're seeing really short bid windows and tight deadlines. The Procurement Act sets out a time scale for each one of the potential procurement processes, and also offers a number of discounts against that timeline. So all the timelines within the Act are now calculated as working days rather than the previous regime that was calendar days. And the average tender window is 25 working days. But it also offers discounts. So if a procuring organisation is going to advertise that opportunity electronically, they can take 5 days off. If they have issued a pipeline notice to make the market aware that something was likely to come out, they can take 5 days off. If it's an emergency, and they can evidence it was an emergency that wasn't of their creation, they can take more time off. So the tightest deadline you'll be expected to turn around a bid is 10 days. So they're making really good use of these discounts. So bid windows are getting shorter and deadlines are getting tighter. So you need to be absolutely on the ball if you're going to be bidding for these contracts. We're seeing really high expectations on social value, really high expectations in terms of innovation. But we're also seeing within this fragmented market that commissioner feedback is often coming delayed, so we don't get the intelligence as quickly as we'd like, and sometimes it's vague. And as a consequence, that means when you're bidding for future contracts, you could experience issues with compliance gaps. The evidence that you supported your bid with could be weak, and that could mean you end up being excluded from bidding for future opportunities. What we're seeing that separates successful bids from unsuccessful bids, well, bid no bid discipline is absolutely crucial. If you've got a good gating decision process and you're picking the right opportunities, that will increase your chance of success because you're not wasting your time on opportunities that aren't suitable for you. Bids that are really well evidenced are particularly successful. Bids that are really strong in terms of the outcomes that they're going to achieve and the timelines going to achieve them by are likely to be successful. And what we are seeing is there is a tendency, particularly for smaller organisations, to either underestimate or not understand the requirement to meet deadlines. So evidence issues, vague outcomes and missed deadlines are still the biggest pitfalls that we're seeing. In terms of gate decision, it's important to say no when the fit isn't right and be really disciplined about what you're going for, and only going for those opportunities where you've got a decent chance of success. It's important to have a really good package of clear local evidence and ensure that you can evidence the impact that you're making as part of the tender that you're putting in. And where you have engaged in a SWOT analysis, if you've seen any weaknesses or potential gaps in the offer, winning bids are the ones that offer partnerships to fill those gaps and to make sure that you've got the strongest possible service model. What we would say in terms of performance is a new criteria under which you can be excluded from bidding. And you can be identified as an excluded or excludable organisation. Performance has been put under the excludable criteria. If you have performed poorly in a contract that has been tendered under the Procurement Act, that can be published on the central digital platform. If it's published on the central digital platform, other commissioners you might be bidding to can look at that information and can decide whether to exclude you from future tenders, and under those regulations you can be excluded for up to 5 years from tendering. So it's really important to make sure that you're on top of your performance requirements for any contracts that you're currently delivering. Next slide, please. So in terms of approaching bids, what are the challenges that we're starting to see coming out under the Procurement Act? If there's been an issue in the tender, you've identified some problems. Because of the change from calendar days to working days, standstill periods are shorter. So it's now 8 working days if you need to bring a challenge. Standstill periods are the period between when an organisation announces its intention to award a contract and the actual award. There has to be this cool off period while people are offered the opportunity to challenge. So if you're the winning organisation, that 8 days is really uncomfortable and it's something you just got to get through. If you're in the position where you've identified issues with a potential opportunity, then you've only got that 8 days to bring in bid challenges. So if you have identified issues with the process, you have to be really well prepared to put in that challenge. In terms of the issues around performance and the introduction of new KPIs and the introduction of that excludable status for organisations that haven't performed well, there's much more scrutiny on contract performance. There's going to be much more robust monitoring and a much more robust process in terms of compliance checks. So you need to have your performance and quality regimes absolutely spot on if you're bidding for public contracts. The number and type of exclusion criteria have increased, and amongst those is performance. So it's really important to gain a good understanding of Schedules 6 and 7 of the Act to understand what you could be excluded for and what you could be rendered excludable for, as well, to make sure that you're compliant. If you've got a supply chain, one big change that has been introduced by the Act is that the sins of your supply chain are placed upon you. So if you've got organisations within your supply chain that have contravened against some of those exclusion criteria, it will impact your bid. So you need to make sure that you select your supply chains and your partners really, really carefully. And if an issue is identified, you need to evidence that you can act on that really quickly, because it extends to full supply chains. So what we would say to meet these challenges, make sure you're performing really well on any contracts that you've already got and on any grants that you've got. Really prepare carefully for audits and compliance reviews. So make sure you've got really strong financial governance and really strong strategic governance arrangements, and make sure you're as transparent as possible, because all that will stand you in good stead and bidding for contracts. And engage early with buyers. You know, build transparency, build trust. Make sure you're speaking to the right people. Make sure they're aware of what you can do and the impact that you can make on that local community. Next slide, please, Simon. So what all this mean? Well, overall, since the Act came into force, end of February, the procurement opportunities in the southwest of England have been estimated to be around 3 billion a year, and that's a substantial proportion of the national procurement landscape. There's been a significant increase in the number of preliminary engagement notices issued, so that indicates there's a lot of activity. And in the southwest, there's been around 150 procurement engagement notices being issued since March. So that indicates that the commissioners, procurement teams are looking to engage early and actively with organisations in the market. It isn't clear from the procurement engagement notice that we've seen in the southwest how much that is worth, but that's something that will be worked out as the central digital platform starts to develop. In terms of awards, in the last 12 months, we've seen around 2,100 award notices in the southwest. So quite clearly, there's a lot of active procurement in the southwest, and there's the strong contract completion rates. So that means that a lot of the opportunities that are going out there, those tendering windows aren't concluding in no award. There's a high proportion of tender windows that are concluding in contracts being awarded. In terms of the link through to the comprehensive spending review, we're seeing significant procurement activity in the southwest around health. 130 health contracts have been published in the last 8 weeks, and we're seeing an increase in opportunities around housing. There's really strong housing procurement activity, so there's been several significant contracts. So there's one in Millbrook, Cornwall, is worth about 4 million. Sanctuary Housing have spent about 1.5 million in the area, and there's lots of housing association contracts going out around ancillary services, so things like welfare benefits and debt advice, service contracts. So overall, there's been an increase nationally. Nationally, we've seen about 1,500 buyers going to market since the Procurement Act came into force, and overall nationally, those preliminary engagement notices, of which we've seen sort of 3 billion in the southwest recently, they're covering around 320 billion pounds overall. So there's a significant amount of opportunities out there through procurement and engagement, and we're seeing a lot of activity around local government, around NHS. Next slide, please, Simon. So what can you do about all this? If you only do one thing today, if you're going to do one thing as a consequence of this webinar, it's go and register on the Central Digital Platform. The Central Digital Platform replaces what was the official journal of the European Union. It also replaces a number of UK-based services like Finder Tender, Contract Finder, Tenders Electronic Daily, and a number of smaller digests of notices. Central Digital Platform is being based on the Finder Tender service, and the Central Digital Platform is the way you will find out about opportunities. That's where all the notices will be published. It's about where procurement teams and commissioning teams learn about you, and it's where they will do all the due diligence requirements around tendering. What they'll look at is the information that you publish on there, about your organisation, and the aim is eventually it will replace the standard selection questionnaire or the PQQ stage of tenders. So you need to go on the central digital platform, register, make sure all your due diligence information is on there, make sure information about any directors or trustees you've got is on there, and after following that process, you will receive a number, a PPON number, that is your unique identifier that will be used in any contracting and any tendering, and you will also be able to generate what they call FTS numbers, find a tender share numbers. And what happens is once you've generated those numbers, you will provide those as part of your tender, and that enables the procurement teams to look at your records on the central digital platform to assess whether you're an organisation they want to work with. So that's how they access your due diligence information. Second thing to understand from today is look at those exclusion and compliance risks. As we've already stressed, poor past performance can impact your ability to bid. There's a whole range of really strict rules now around what you can be excluded for in terms of bidding. A lot of it's around things like fraud, terrorism, and criminal acts. But there are a number of new requirements around that kind of discretionary exclusion, that excludable status that you'll need to understand, and you can find those in guidance from the Cabinet Office and in Schedules 6 and 7 of the Act itself. We'd say go away and look at the potential risk around using AI in developing bids. There's real emphasis on transparency around the use of artificial intelligence. Procurement teams will have to declare when they're using it to assess bids, and they will need to declare the parameters by which your bid will be assessed by AI. But there's also a requirement on you. If you have used an AI to produce any element of your tender, you need to declare that as part of the tender, and it will be incorporated in the evaluation procedures. Be prepared. Be absolutely prepared. All these new procurement procedures require agility, flexibility, and speed once a tender's been announced. So having absolutely everything prepared, what your service model's going to look like, having all your due diligence information, any evidence that you may want to support your bids prepared before that tender drops is hugely important. And engage. If you've identified opportunities, you've identified the type of commissioning organisations that you want to work with, they're required to engage with you. They're required to understand their markets. So they're now, before tenders become available, it's really important, particularly with those NHS bodies, to engage well, to engage positively, and let them know that you exist and what you do. Next slide, please, Simon. So central digital platform, what do you need to do? Register. If you've already registered for Find a Tender, you will need to re-register for the central digital platform. They are based on the same area of the internet, Find a Tender, but the processes have changed and the way you access that service has changed. It has moved over to the one government log-on system, and so if you've ever done anything like pay for your car tax online, it's similar, except it's for your organisation. And so if you've previously registered for Find a Tender, you will still need to re-register for the central digital platform. Go ahead, get registered. That will prevent you from missing opportunities. It's an absolute requirement for bidding on public contracts. So if you want to bid for contracts, you have to be on there. Once you're on there and you've got all your due diligence information on, set up alerts for the type of tenders that you're interested in. And that way you'll get real-time updates. You'll get emails in your inbox about what's available. Use it to monitor contract pipelines. Most commissioning authorities are now required to publish pipelines of what they're going to be tendering for the next 18 months. And so it's vitally important that you access those pipelines to know when tenders you're interested in are likely to come up. And make sure that you have entered in, you have saved searches for the type of opportunities that you want to access. And that means you'll be able to return to those searches and conduct them on an automated basis, on a regular basis, to make sure that you're always up to date. What does it mean? All it means is there's only one place to register now. You may need to still register with local procurement portals to actually engage in a tender. But in terms of looking for opportunities, it means there's now one place. So you don't need to have multiple logins. You don't need to have multiple people surfing the internet looking for opportunities. All the notices have to be published in this one single place. It makes engaging with potential buyers a lot easier because they have to identify themselves, and you can find them a lot easier because they're all in one place. And it will enable you to monitor their timetables about when they're open to engagement and when they're likely to be engaging in soft market testing. And it gives you much greater transparency. It gives you real easy access to procurement data, to information about what contracts the potential buyers have already awarded, who it's gone to, and when they're likely to be up again. And in the fullness of time, it will also give information on bid performance and contract performance. So if the incumbent isn't performing well, that will be published on the central digital platform, and you'll be aware of which contracts you're likely to be able to target. Next slide, please. So this is the last one from me. I'm sure you'll be pleased to know. If you could just click through the animation. We're getting to that kind of slump in the afternoon. You've all had lunch, and thanks very much, Simon. So as we said, can't stress it enough, register for the central digital platform. If you're not registered, you're not going to be able to bid. Make sure that you set up your tender alerts so you don't miss the opportunities that are of interest to you. Make sure that you've checked the guidance around exclusions and governance. All this is published via the Crown Commercial Service and the Government Commercial Office via the Cabinet Office website. There's loads of really useful guidance on there, and it's written really well. Things like the guidance on how to register for the central digital platform are written from an ease of understanding perspective. So most of the guidance around this is pretty easy to understand and is very well structured. So make sure that you understand the potential to you being excluded and understand the governance risks around procurement. Make sure that you're prepared for AI. It's not going to go away. It is going to be used as part of assessment criteria, and there is an expectation that it will be used in the preparation of tenders, and that's why they've built in provision for declarations. And make sure you've got a really solid bid strategy in place that emphasises the social value that you bring to your local communities, both as an employer, but also as a community organisation. Simon.
Very good. Thanks, Matthew. Yeah, I hope you came with us on that, and it was of value and of interest, and there's a few nuggets that you can take away with you and actually implement. I'm not going to labour this. I mentioned it earlier, but we do offer end-to-end business development support. Think about capacity, really. I think that's the key. So, if you feel like you need more capacity around expertise or bid writing or opportunity planning, or even the bid, no bid analysis or social value impact, which we're seeing a lot of traction in actually recently since the Procurement Act, just drop us a line. We're offering a 30-minute separate consultation, which we can focus on the Procurement Act and what it means to you. Just let us know. Drop me a line. Absolutely fine. That's basically that. And I'll mention the feedback form as well. So please do send that back when you receive it. We've got a bit of time for Q&A, I think. If would anyone? I see Dave Potts has got a hand up. Do you want to sort of come in and ask your question?
Hi, yeah. Mine is around in the previous regime around contracting authority status, because on previous contracts we were audited by Government Internal Audit Agency, and they expected any VCSE organisations that had more than 50% of their income from public funds to effectively run their procurement as a contracting authority. So does that apply under this Act as well? Because it's fairly fundamental for particularly small charities who, a number of our partner organisations suddenly realised more than 50% of their funding was public, and it had a big impact.
Yep, I can take that one. It's a little bit of a grey area at the moment, to be honest, with the acts only coming in March. There are subtle changes, and we really need to see how that's going to pan out. But ultimately, the rules are broadly the same. So they're looking at things like 50% of income. They're also looking at things like more than 50% of the governance of the organisation being under control of a public sector body. So if you've had people appointed to you as a trustee as a part of a contract requirement, that's also looked at. I know NCVO has been asking questions about this, and it's something that we will continue to look into. But at the moment, it's a bit of a grey area. We have spoken to a couple of solicitors firms about this very issue, and we've received multiple answers. And so the only kind of responsible response we can give is your mileage may vary depending on who you speak to. So there's no real definitive answer yet, but it's early days. It only came in March. And there's no one really challenged anything yet, so there's no case law to sit behind any of this.
Thank you.
Pam, you have a question?
Yeah, thanks, Simon. Yeah, mine was one for Matthew around PSR, Matthew. So local authorities can use the provider selection regime if they're commissioning health and care services. Ours seem particularly reluctant to do that. I just wondered if you've got any experience or examples of where you've seen a local authority use the PSR in favour of the Procurement Act for any particular health and care services.
From memory, I've only seen one, and that was in the East Midlands, and it was a local authority seeking to resecure a public health related service, and it was an organisation providing advice that could evidence significant health impacts, and it was a service that was allied to a social prescribing service, and they used the PSR to direct award that public health contract because it was an existing incumbent and there was no change to the service specification. So that's the only time that personally I've seen it, but I can look in to see if it's been used elsewhere.
Okay, thanks.
Great. Is there any more questions? I know we're getting short on time, but if there's any more questions, I'm sure Matthew will be able to try and answer them. Okay, Becky.
Thank you both. I've got a couple of questions. Neil's got one. I've got a couple of questions, but I'll send them to you both offline rather than taking everyone's lunch hours. But Neil, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks, Becky. It's just a quick one, really, because thanks, Matthew. The thing you mentioned about social value and sort of how it's less about your impact on the community as a VCSE and more as your impact as an employer. Is that something you feel is that an issue with Tom's, perhaps? I know one of the critiques of Tom's a couple of years ago was that it kind of leans more towards some things than others, and I know in my experience there was a lot of kind of construction industry kind of involvement and those sort of social value conversations early on. So is that something you feel is an issue, and is there a way around that?
It's well, there's two separate questions there. One, is there a way around that? It's around influencing. It is, if you're dealing with a local authority or you're dealing with a local commissioner, there's no mandatory requirement on them to use a specific framework. So it is possible to influence around the type of social value measures that they're looking at. And we have worked with organisations where we have influenced that particular commissioner to move away from models that they were looking at. So it is possible to do that if you engage well and you can evidence that impact. In terms of the social value terms, I think a lot of it comes from the fact that this process, this methodology for looking at social value has to be one size fits all. And as a consequence, it has to encompass a whole range of organisations because the social value requirements are global. And they're particularly acute in the social care sector, where it's a real mixed market, real mixed economy. And so as a consequence, a lot of the elements within the models that we're seeing are kind of skewed towards a private sector organisation, particularly, and the biggest problem I feel for one sector, particularly the measures around volunteering. There are measures in the TOM that are about volunteering hours and volunteering time, and they are entirely focused on corporate social responsibility programs. So if you've got volunteers and they're volunteering for you and they're helping to provide that service, you can't count them. It has to be somebody volunteering from your organisation for somebody else. But that said, it can play the other way, particularly if you're working with a prime. If you're working with a private sector prime, it's now a lot easier to push them into a corporate social responsibility scheme where you're gaining benefit from their employees in terms of volunteers. And we have seen that used by voluntary sector organisations to gain access to like senior managers of big organisations to help them improve their governance procedures or their financial monitoring. But yeah, ultimately, if you're a voluntary community sector organisation, a lot of the regimes that are used to measure social value aren't ideal, but that's because they're required to be one size fits all. It is most acute for those bigger contracts that were for particularly where they're being procured by central government bodies, because it is mandatory for them to use the MACs, the model assessment criteria, and the model assessment criteria are not well aligned to the voluntary sector.
Thanks, Matthew.
Pam, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I was just going to say on that point, Matthew, that's actually incredibly disappointing, given that there's all the noise about how much better the new Procurement Act is or advantageous for SMEs and VCSE. And yet on something as fundamental as that, where as a voluntary sector organisation, unless you're a CVS, ironically, you're less likely to have volunteers volunteering for other charities. You're more likely to have volunteers volunteering for your cause. In fact, many of the organisations, wouldn't survive without volunteers. Some of them work on almost a volunteer model. I mean, what Claire Newport here from Citizens Advice, I mean, they have a specific volunteer programme for their benefits and debt advisors, which is 12 weeks of training, etc., etc. So that means that if someone was bidding against them for something, they couldn't count those volunteers under the social value, whereas somebody different could. That's what you're saying, isn't it?
Well, what is important?
Army.
What's important is to influence around the measures that are being selected, and what we would do in that case is we would focus much more on the measures within that framework that benefit the voluntary sector. What I'd say is, if you are going to influence around it, and they are going to be using that particular framework, then don't rely on the volunteering measures. Go for something like local employment. So some of the measures that are around the benefits that your employees achieve as a result of working for your organisation, and look at things around accredited training, because then that's where you can include your volunteers to say that you're offering accredited training to volunteers. For the voluntary sector, yes, it is disappointing that those measures around volunteering don't favour the voluntary sector, but there is the opportunity to influence those commissioners to move them away from thinking that is the type of measure they should be looking at when they're looking at including voluntary sector organisations. Because ultimately the aim of those measures was to push larger organisations into corporate social responsibility programmes,
rather than to push smaller local voluntary sectors out of the procurement opportunity.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we better wrap it up there. Thank you so much, Matthew. Thank you, Simon, for your time today. Thank you all for coming along. I find that really helpful, really insightful, actually. And we will, of course, send out the slides, the feedback forms, if you wouldn't mind filling those in, please. Oh, Mary's gone again. I found that really helpful, and I think it's all reinforced what we know around the importance of collaboration, partnerships. Helped me a bit around social value, even though that discussion just now was a bit disheartening. But I think, it's better to be aware of it, and we can work it out. But that was really helpful. Thank you all so much. And yeah, we'll get that all out to you. Thanks for joining us today. Take care, everyone.
Thanks for the time, everyone. Cheers.
Thanks. Bye.